Welcome all together. This is what I built today. It's a full weathering and building video of this small Kugelpanzer. We will have a look into oil rendering, enhancing hairspray chipping, applying some mud effects of course, and finishing the model off with factory markings. You're watching Tank Brusher. Thanks for subscribing. Let's get into it. So this is the Kugelpanzer, the box from Das Werk. I'm sorry for doing Das Werk twice in a row, but I just bought this kit. I find it interesting. It's in cooperation with Amusing Hobby, and the contents of this box is about as plentiful as the history of it. We get the identical kit twice with one sheet of decals and a short manual. The sprue looks fine. There is one model kit on each sprue, making it a 2-in-1 box, a real 2-in-1 box. I have no problem with the molding. I find it quite good detailed. That's Amusing Hobby, of course. They invented the molding or manufactured the molding, and thus Werk branding and distributing it now available for us scale modelers. Quite an interesting topic. The whole thing is existing in Kubnica Tank Museum near Moscow. We know not much about it. It's all a thesis, a story. The whole thing was supposedly manufactured by Krupp in Essen, Germany, sent over to Japan. They fielded it. The Russians captured it. I don't know what's true, and it certainly appears in not a single one of my books dating from a time pre-internet. Nevertheless, it's not the first turd that was built by Krupp, and surely not the last. The build is enjoyably fast. It's one sprue, it's 2 steps in the manual. There's really nothing to write home about. The only thing is these two half spheres create an ugly seam, and otherwise there should be no challenge for any beginner or any scale modeler liking some not mainstream tanks, I would say, and this is why I build it. I like prototypes much more than the mainstream tanks. But now, with the model built, let's move on in the painting. I keep this quite fast, so just a layer of primer, very thin applied, thinned with lacquer thinner, and then I would like to follow with the first attempt of closing these gaps with Vallejo putty. It's a little bit thinned down using water, just applying it in the recesses of this seam. I don't want to sand it afterwards, since I have not a single sanding stick that would fit inside there yet. It's not quite perfect from the result, but better than nothing. I will improve on this. Next step was a layer of gray. That's the XF63 German gray. I would like to get the impression of a cast iron here a little bit, a cast steel, and this is why I dusted it using a random brown. This leads directly into the hairspray. That's the first layer of a hairspray I already own. I didn't buy it for scale modeling, followed by a second layer and letting it dry. Now we can look into the factory color, this iron oxide red. But dead stop here. I changed something. From now we used lacquer thinner. This leads to a very hard surface and it's not easy to chip. I got the advice to use X20A thinner instead for the layers I would like to create chips with. And this works perfectly, I have to say. I was impressed with the difference. For applying the red oxide primer, it's a little bit tempting to use this dark gray surface as a layer for a shading, but this was not what I was after here for the end result, so I kept it to a bare minimum. I would like to create chips instead and use washes for the whole thing. So I added a few drops of X20A thinner to my chipping water and started to rub along the edges of the running surface for the wheel spheres, halves, whatever, and created some chips. And immediately I noticed the chips form like you would expect them to form on acrylic paints, in large flakes out of scale and a little bit too heavy to be a very satisfactory finish in the end. But it's fine here. Just remembering Rinaldi's best advice: as soon as you see a chip forming, move on. I was curious about how this whole thing will turn out in the end, so I moved on directly in one of the last steps. I'm not a fan of doing step by step by step by step. I just used my graphite pen and rubbed along the outer edges of the running gear wheels. I just call it spheres from now on, okay? And with the polished contact surfaces, we get a first full picture, and we immediately see what we already know. Bare, flat, pale red oxide primer looks very boring, and this is what we have to attack now in the next phase. First step, wash. No, not a pin wash. I'll not bore you with this. Of course I do a pin wash, but what is different is the excess on the panel lines are not cleaned off. They are stippled into the surface, creating a little bit darker, more greasy, grimy edges and corners of each panel. This darkens the thing a little bit down and would be the first step, or overdoing this would be the first step in getting a grim dark mood for tabletop painting, for example. But this is okay, not the whole thing I want to do. I just would like to get an initial layer of a little bit a darker color, the shadow areas in the corner, just framing them and claiming some of the space that would be taken otherwise by the very boring red oxide. And I prefer, after all, a enamel wash for doing this, just because it dries within hours and not within days compared to the oil paint. To mess around in a red hue, we need a different red. White oil paint will not work. I got this one from a set I bought a while ago. A white would create a pink, and we need a higher saturated red to contrast on red. Now I stipple on just some dry flakes, some little dots. That's randomly applied, keeping it in the center, the highest aerial concentration of the red primer. What I would like to show is a wet technique. So the brush is always wet with enamel odorless thinner, not dripping wet, no drops are forming, there's just something on there. Dipping the brush into a thinner, unloading it on a paper towel, and then moving the pigments of the oil paint around on the surface in a more or less random, more cloudy way. I would like to create little dots, blurred out dots of red paint, and then I come back over and over again and remove some of the shape again. Think of a half moon with one sharp edge and one that is blurred, and this is what I would like to achieve here in a more or less random way, leaving just a few areas unaffected by this technique. So we create a shadow, this kind of variation on the surface that looks very natural and very interesting. This can be repeated multiple times, and this is my understanding of an oil rendering technique. I don't know if this is coherent with what Michael Rinaldi is teaching or just another way to do it. It is obvious this is a very tedious process, and it takes some time and some effort and some messing around, as well as a good natural hair brush, of course. I would not necessarily attempt this on a large model. I slowly but surely value the 1/72nd scale for scale modeling, for doing more advanced techniques in the same amount of time we have for our hobby. I'm not switching over, but just saying I highly appreciate now the smaller scales. A second thing I can do with this oil technique, or I was after with this oil technique, is enhancing the chips we formed previously. You have to experience this, is hard to describe, but on the enamel odorless thinner, the pigment floats and the pigment adheres to itself, so you can drag it around. It's hard to describe, but it's quite very effective and enjoyable to do. So I was after creating a very hard, harsh edge on the chips and fading it back into the unaffected surface. This creates this slightly altered border that gives our chips dimension. And with the oil paint you can blend this a little bit better than when applying the chips with a brush, so the effect is overall more believable and more in scale. I quite like this effect a lot here, aside from the different reflections of light in the cast surface. You see a little bit of dust here on the half spheres. This was due to a little bit impurity in my thinner caused by adding this mud effect from the next phase. Shouldn't have happened, I'm sorry, has no large impact. This is a heavy mud product I use quite often from Ammo by Mick, and in there's a little bit of this textured paste that doesn't mix very well, but yeah, it serves the purpose. So either you own a good set of sanding sticks or some textured mud, and best of course is owning both. I will adjust this, but of course now this seam has to be gone for the last steps, and mud is the weapon of choice. I apply it in the most recessed areas of this running or gripping surface, and then I come back to clean up. Cleaning up is more important than applying in this case. I use my brush cleaned with enamel odorless thinner and give each of these recesses a U shape. I just go in and spread the mud to the sides. I think it would adhere better to the ribs instead of the sloped surface, and this is what I would like to replicate here. A little bit a stiffer brush helps by cleaning the ribs off. I want the surface, the front surface, in a bare metal and some of the side areas cleaned as well, so we expose some of the chipping back again. However, I was not happy with the very bright mud effect, so I came back with earth and toned it down just a little bit so it would fit better in the middle of the red oxide and the white markings that are following now. Last major step in this project is adding some factory markings. Some person in the manufacturing process writing something more or less meaningful onto it. And I use a watercolor pencil. Sounds silly, funny, whatever. Yet it's an artist supply. I know that AK Interactive is branding this as weathering pencils. I think this is quite the same. You can use them like a pen, and dry rubbing on it will affect it a little bit, such as pigments, for example. The wet finger will remove it. With too much water we can almost remove it and blur it. I would like to use this a little bit more, these pencils, in the upcoming projects. That's why I show you how they work. A little bit more refined dose of water will be able to blend this paint or this color effect to good use, I think. Enamel odorless thinner has absolutely no effect of the pigments or the pigment binder, the medium that is used in this pen, and this is quite nice to know, I guess. Of course, this kit is supplied with a sheet of decals. I think about passing the second Kugelpanzer in this kit on to a friend, and he would be happy to have a fully intact sheet for decals, so no demonstrating them, sorry. But back into the factory markings. From each side of the tank I would like to have something more or less meaningful written on the tank, give this high contrast between the white and the dark red oxide primer. The number I'm writing on is the invoice number of the Tigers sold to the Japanese government, just this little Easter egg, and on the other side a reference to a very loose bolt, I guess. I don't think we had Newton meter as a measurement unit of torque in this era of industrial paganism, but it could also be a quite fitting reference, putting this vehicle in the time where somebody decided we have a good joke and add this to an authentic existing collection that was actually made in that time, and write a piece of history in this way, since we have no primary resources about this vehicle. Still, this could be possible. But now let's get into the last steps. I wanted to have a ring of dirt around these half spheres just to mirror the dirt or mud that has accumulated in the running surface. Yeah, but I applied some of a mixture of this heavy mud and earth, just very slightly textured, and blended it in from all sides. I wanted the inner border a little bit more harsh and circular, and the outer one more blended, faded out, with leaving these emphasized chipping areas still exposed. I couldn't match my picture I had in the mind to 100%, but I'm still fine with the result. A last ring of dirt is applied to the transition area from the vertical into the spherical surface and blended back in. It looks a little bit harsher than it is in real life, since I'm flooding it with light, of course, as well as a nearly last step was to apply this dirt colors, dust color, to some of the previously panel washed or washed areas, give it a little bit more depth. Last step, of course, is then using the graphite pen once more and renewing the polished surfaces. They lost their pigmentation due to me touching it. With this last small repair step, I think I got a finished model out of it. It looks quite well, I hope. I think so. I let you be the judges, of course, like always. Not claiming any authority here. I'm just building the models as I like to do it and improve on the way. If you haven't subscribed, thank you for doing so. Now, of course, you guys watch the information box down below and my pinned comment to what we do next week. I would like to keep publishing every Thursday, so see you next week. Happy modeling. Hope you enjoyed the video.